2023. We will, I think, get going, and I'm sure other people will join us as we're going. But today, Molly, as you all know, is the star of the show. She's worked very hard since the beginning of the calendar year at the State House, talking about charter schools all the time and how they fit into, or sometimes thankfully don't fit into some of these education bills that passed. For those of you who I have not gotten to meet, I'm Marcy Brown Carter. I run the Indiana Charter School Network, and most of you work at schools and you are all members of the group. If you don't know me personally or don't see my name in your inbox frequently already, feel free to drop your name, your school, your position, your email in the chat, and I'll try to get you added so you see emails more regularly. But with that, we'll let Molly take over and tell us what happened this legislative session and how it affects charter schools. Thank you, Molly.
Thanks, Marcy, and thank you for everyone for joining on this Friday. I'm sure you'd rather be doing other things, but I appreciate you joining. So we started, as Marcy said, at the beginning of January, and then session just wrapped up last Friday. By law, they were required to wrap up yesterday, but they were able to get done a little less than a week early. Which is both good and bad. As I keep saying, they have less time to pass laws, but they also end up combining a lot of bills into one and making really big bills. So you'll see here soon in some of the slides there, unfortunately, is still a lot of regulations they're placing on really on all school types. So we will get started though, and this was a short session. So not a budget year, that will be next year. So we really couldn't do a ton that had large fiscal impacts. That's reserved for a budget year, so that will be next year. On to the next slide. So just a quick highlight. There were actually, between the House and Senate, 739 total bills filed, and of those filed, 172 passed the General Assembly. I believe all education bills except one so far have been signed by the governor. But there's, I mean, that's about 23% that ultimately passed. Which unfortunately is still a lot of new laws out there. For education specifically, there were 75 bills that were filed at the beginning of the session that are focused purely on education, and 19 of them passed into law. As I have said, 19 may not seem like a lot, but once I start going through these slides, you'll understand there is a lot that they're trying to do this year. This was a big year in education. On to the next slide. So we're going to hit on just a couple of things that are specific to charters. A lot of it's really cleanup from past legislative sessions. And then we'll start going through all the other legislation that is impacting charters. And then we'll kind of talk about going forward, next steps. So on to the next slide. So 270 is the first bill I want to highlight. Majority of this bill is truly cleanup or additional clarification for laws that were previously passed to make sure that they're functioning as was originally intended. Some of you might remember from the last budget session. So in 2023, they passed a law that required the sharing of the incremental growth in local property tax dollars with charter school students. That starts in fiscal year 2025, and it is for 4 counties only at this time. So there was actually some cleanup that needed to be done. So this bill 270 just clarified that language to reference property tax levies that are collected as opposed to imposed. So they can, as I said, make sure that it's actually functioning properly as was originally intended. This came from discussions with DOE and with the Department of Local Government Finance to make sure that the money is actually flowing, that you can't necessarily distribute or share what you haven't actually collected. And so that's kind of the basis behind that provision, that cleanup. Another cleanup provision in here looks back at another bill from 2023, 391, and that exempted school corps from the existing $1 law if they chose to share referendum dollars with a charter school. So there is further clarification that was done in this bill to really tighten and strengthen that to ensure, once again, it's functioning as properly intended last year by the legislature. So it's looking back at May 4th, 2023, the provision in 270. And specifically stating that school corps are only eligible for this exemption if they proportionally distribute operating referendum funds and school safety referendum funds, if applicable, I guess, with local charter schools. And there's a very specific method described in the statute. So it's, once again, just really tightening, strengthening, making sure that it is working. And I can say the exact same things about the next provisions that also all touch on the dollar law. I don't want to get too in the weeds on all this because there is a lot to go through. We will be sharing this PowerPoint so everyone will be able to look at it a lot further in a lot more detail. So any provisions I don't hit on, just know you will be getting this PowerPoint. So there's further clarifications in the dollar law beyond just that exemption that I mentioned, and really cleaning it up and making sure that or working to make sure that schools are sharing buildings and putting them on that dollar law list. So I won't walk through every little piece on here, but we will go on to the next slide. But the main highlight, 270, is really a cleanup of existing laws and making sure everything is functioning and working for charter schools. So one final piece I want to mention that's in 1380, that's another cleanup from the year before. So it required sharing of operating and school safety referendum dollars, as I mentioned, in Marion, Lake, St. Joseph, Vanderburgh counties. So in 1380, they just cleaned up the actual referendum timeline. There are some provisions in there that didn't make sense. They seemed a little bit backwards once you started looking at how to implement the legislation. Oftentimes they write things and then how it's written in the law isn't actually how it would work and didn't truly make sense. So this is purely a cleanup just to make sure it can actually take place, the referendum sharing, that the timeline works for everyone. And that would be really for both charters and the traditional public school that needed additional clarification. There were some other changes regarding innovation network schools. So very specific to their agreements. There were some restrictions on altering the agreements. It ensured that 100% of state tuition support dollars are flowing to these innovation schools. It prohibited a school corp from charging innovation school for goods and services with a few exemptions in there. And I guess I have the main one included on here. So the goal of all these provisions in there is really just to focus on the autonomy of these innovation schools to really strengthen that for them and ensure they can do what they need to do and keep educating students and not have to worry about other issues. So on to some non-charter specific legislation, but also in 1380, they are having the Secretary of Education, she's going to be required to create a report to create a pilot program looking at facilities and looking at transportation. And the goal of that is to ensure that students can actually access the school of their choice, so going to and from school, and also looking at the facilities, who's managing them. Maybe it needs to be a third party, maybe not. The same with transportation. Would it make sense to have a logistics company focus on the transportation? So it's just a concept right now. We will see what comes of it. There's always discussions on this. I'd say the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion on both facilities and transportation to truly look at all school types and figure out how we can get students to the schools that they want. And then just lastly, I'll hit on the Student Learning Recovery Grant Program. So if you remember, in 2021, this was passed into law, and it just provides that the program is subject to available funding, and then it removed some provisions that no longer are applicable. But specifically, they removed the expiration of the program so that it can keep moving forward and keep helping students, and making sure that there's really intervention for these students. On to the next slide. So more in 1380. So as you can see, this is kind of one of the first of the big bills. Some of the other bills have 4 or 5 slides. So this one almost looks small compared to some of those. So looking at the Indiana Learns program, you may have heard this referred to as a micro grant program or the Indiana Student Enrichment Grant Program. But I think the true kind of public name of it is Indiana Learns. So they also removed the expiration of this program so that it can continue to help students as well. And so it was set to expire later this year. So they removed that and then repealed some other provisions so that other dollars besides just federal dollars can be placed into this program, and really ensuring the longevity of the program. A couple other things. I won't walk through every single piece on in this bill, but one thing they did add in, and this applies to all school types, is that the school shall authorize the absence or excuse of a student, making sure they're not a habitually truant student, really a student that's in good standing, when they are ordered to active duty with the armed forces. So a lot of this came from the National Guard, in which it didn't, kind of their boot camps, there wasn't enough time for the students to participate in their boot camps or trainings. They actually would have, if they had gone back to school, they would have been considered AWOL from the National Guard. So there are just kind of some logistical issues that didn't make sense. So they extended this to 15 days. I can't remember exactly if it was 10 or 12 days originally or something around there, but it's now 15 days. And just making sure that these students that are in the National Guard, that they can actually get the training, do the active duty that they need to do. I think those are the main things I want to highlight. There's other pieces in here that are important as well, but for the sake of time, I won't go through every single provision. So it's, once again, I encourage you to look back at this. So on to the next slide. So this is a big one that you've probably seen a lot of headlines about. And this will take a little bit to get through. And I do really want to try to go through almost every one of these provisions if I can. You've probably referred or heard this referred to as the retention bill. There's a lot of other pieces in it before you even kind of get to the retention. So I want to walk through it in as much detail as I can. So the first piece of it is looking at that screening, identification, and intervention. So it's requiring schools to provide instruction that's aligned with science of reading for K through 8. You've heard science of reading. It's really kind of the popular phrase to use these days. And there was a lot of legislation passed last year related to it. Nationwide, the science of reading is where other states are moving as well. So trying to get back to that. And so it also requires elementary schools to administer a universal screener to K through 2 students to start identifying them, getting them interventions as soon as possible for those who may not be proficient in reading. It's also then requiring DOE to find a vendor, a preferred vendor, to work with the schools that are below 70% proficiency on iRead. And the schools that are above that 70%, you guys are encouraged, but you're not ultimately required to use one of those vendors. And then DOE is going to put out guidance on the number of times that the assessment is required and then when it should be administered. And really for all of these bills, I'm hitting on the highlights, but there's a lot more, as you know, that goes into implementing them than what I am just hitting on today. So I would expect DOE in the next couple of weeks, I talked to them yesterday and they said in the next several weeks they should have guidance put out for schools So they are diving through all the bills just as I am, and figuring out exactly what they need to communicate to schools to make everything function. So more to come from DOE. I would look for guidance in their weekly newsletters. If you don't access that already, let Marcy or I know, and we will make sure you get access. Or if you just want the guidance, we're happy to share that as well once it's out. So some of the other provisions in this bill, it requires elementary schools to administer iRead to all second grade students. So it looks like, though, a majority of schools, of elementary schools, I should say, have already opted in to do this for this coming school year. So before this requirement even was passed into law, it looks like a majority. So just over 1,000 elementary schools have already opted into to give this in the next school year. The State Board of Education, they are going to be required to create a method for virtual administration of iLearn. So at this time, it only says iLearn. I believe the focus of this, after talking to DOE, will be for virtual schools. And once again, just looking at iLearn, depending on how it goes, it's possible in the future they could expand it to iRead, and that they could expand it to not virtual schools, but I think we're a little bit ways away from that still. So we will see where that goes, but I would believe that provision is still going to be focused only on virtual schools. And then the bill also required students and parents to get really detailed information from the vendor that's easier to understand than what a lot of them receive today, regarding their students' iRead results. And then it's requiring schools to notify parents of these results, of any kind of interventions that are needed to help that student if they are not proficient in reading at that time. And then DOE is going to put out a survey as well, kind of seeing exactly, asking schools what they're doing in terms of interventions already, and then how those are being funded, to see how they can best support themselves, to have them best support schools. So more to come on that. And then the next piece is the summer school, which you may have heard a little bit about already. So this is looking at this coming school year again. So this is all being implemented pretty quickly. So beginning in this school year, schools are required to offer summer school courses with students who are, or for students who are not proficient in reading or at risk of not being proficient. You are able to partner with other schools. I know this could be a large challenge for many schools to implement. You are able to partner with other schools, no matter the school type, and kind of offer one set course, or one summer school program. And then, so summer school will not technically be required of the student, but if the student is opting in to attend summer school, they have to achieve a 90% attendance rate in that summer reading course. And if not, then the student is going to be required to participate in an individual reading plan for that following school year. And all of this has to be implemented or taught by someone who has a background in the science of reading. And I think those are the big items on there. On to the next slide. And so this is more on Senate Enrolled Act 1, or the literacy bill. So now we're getting into the retention piece that a lot of you have probably heard about. So this is looking at this coming school year as well. So in the next school year, in the iRead administration of the next spring, so 2025 spring, it's requiring retention of students in grade 3, in addition to remediation if the student is not passing iRead. And that's after what will be 3 attempts in the future. So potentially looking at that second grade iRead attempt, possibly summer school if they're taking that, and then that 3rd grade attempt as well. So in the future, it won't necessarily be this year, but in the future, there will be 3 attempts for them to take iRead and pass it. There are exemptions to the retention. So if the student's already been retained the prior year, or if they meet a good cause exemption. So some of this was already in rule that they ended up codifying and just putting into law on the good cause exemption. It's not exact, but it's very similar to that. So the good cause exemptions are if a student has a disability or their IEP specifies that retention is not appropriate in that case. Looking at an English learner who has received services for fewer than 2 years and a committee has determined that promotion to 4th grade is appropriate. If they have already had a math score of proficient or higher on iLearn, and then if they were retained twice in kindergarten through 2nd grade and have already had intensive intervention for 2 or more years. So there are a lot of little pieces to this. Once again, look for more guidance to be coming out in the next coming weeks, especially since this is going to be occurring next school year. And then it's asking that schools have to establish a policy or a procedure to allow a parent to appeal the student's retention if they believe they should have received a good cause exemption, but the student didn't receive one. And then lastly, DOE is going to be required to notify parents of these retention requirements ahead of time. And then looking at the continued monitoring, so after the retention, kind of the next piece to talk about are the monitoring, what's going to happen going forward. So schools must continue the progress to monitor the progress of students who have failed to achieve a passing score on the assessment. It's also requiring a non-passing student to take iRead, even if they received a good cause exemption. They just have to take iRead until they either receive a passing score or they enter the 7th grade. And then lastly, it requires school reporting on interventions for students that are at risk of not being proficient, or for students who have not achieved a passing score on iRead. So there is a lot there. I believe there's one more slide. If you want to go to the next one. I won't highlight every little thing on here, once again, just for the sake of time. But these are kind of the last little pieces of the bill. I guess not little, but the last pieces of it. And we will go on to the next slide. But I would encourage you to walk through everything that I may be skipping over once you get the PowerPoint. So kind of the next part of literacy. This is a big item this year, just literacy in general. And this is the companion bill to the bill we just talked about. So Senate Enrolled Act 6. It's requiring DOE to develop a method and guidance for schools to identify students in grade 4 through 8 who did not pass iRead and are at risk of not being proficient. And DOE also has to tell schools how they can best support these students. So once again, more information from DOE on this. And then kind of the last literacy item I want to highlight was in 212. So we talked really about kind of the K through 12 experience. So this is looking now at teacher prep programs, and it's prohibiting them from using curriculum that's based on the 3 cueing model. So once again, taking back to that science of reading instead. And then the other 2 provisions were actually in 1380. So we already walked through these, but they ended up in this one as well, but it's the exact same language. And on to the next slide. I know I'm going through a lot for you guys, and it's about to get worse. 1243 has a lot of provisions in it. I will hit some of the highlights, but this is one you really will want to take a look through all of it. And we will have a link as well that you can actually walk through and read the bills yourself. If you dare, I should say. They're really large bills, but I will try to hit some of the highlights on here. So 1243 is incredibly important. Looking at diploma requirements, or as I'm sure a lot of you have heard, this kind of rethinking or reimagining of high school. So the first thing is that the State Board of Education, they are required to create a new Indiana diploma for the graduating cohort of 2029. And then this diploma has to indicate either one or both of these things, that a student is prepared for direct entry into the workforce, and or they are prepared for post-secondary education aligned to the student's chosen career path. And then it walks through a whole bunch of other items that State Board also needs to consider when creating the diploma. I won't walk through each one of these, but I would encourage you to take a further look. And then just a reminder that the current law is already requiring State Board to adopt rules on the new diploma in December of this year. They've already had some meetings on some of this already, but they officially have to adopt rules later this year. So more to come. A couple other things I did want to highlight is that looking at some of the bottom bullet points, that schools for the cohort of 2029, the graduating class, a student now has to complete instruction on a computer science requirement as a separate subject. And then they are also extending the personal financial responsibility instruction course as well. So right now that is for high schoolers only, but they're extending it down to 8th grade as well. So those are some of the highlights. On to the next slide, because this is a really big bill. And I should say this bill was actually originally smaller, still big. It was smaller. Then there was another bill that was also big, and they combined it. And then they threw a few other pieces from other bills into it. So it became kind of a massive super bill. So there is a lot to hit on in this one. So I will just hit a couple things though. So redesigning iLearn. So 1243 is creating a through year assessment, or what they're calling checkpoints, for iLearn, with a final summative assessment at the end. So there's going to be 3 checkpoints and then a more shortened summative assessment. At least that's what DOE is saying. That's what they're publicly putting out there. So that is the goal. They're going to put out more information exactly kind of when this should be given. There's a lot that needs to be considered when implementing this, but schools can pilot these checkpoints for this coming school year if you opt in. I won't walk through everything on the math policy, and all of these are requirements of DOE, so they're not new requirements on schools, but on DOE instead. But I would look for more math policy laws to be coming up next legislative session as well. Literacy was kind of the big ticket item this year, and math is not to be forgotten. So that I would expect there'd be a lot more next year. On to the next bill, or next slide. So more on 1243. As I said, this is a really big bill. I am not going to walk through every single piece of this, but specific to charter schools, there is a provision here requiring charter schools to post on their website by July 1 of each year information if there is a family or business relationship between the organizer, owner, and operator of the charter school and the owner of the charter school's building. This was kind of something that the minority party had asked for, and this was kind of a goodwill provision that they put in. It, hopefully isn't too burdensome on anyone. This was kind of the bone they threw them to get them to kind of quiet down on a lot harder provisions that they want to implement on charter schools, looking at transparency, accountability. There's a lot more they want to put on charter schools. So this was kind of the, well, here, we'll give you this one. So that's kind of the background where it came from. So I hope it's not too challenging for you guys. They are trying to have like a gotcha moment, but I'm sure nothing will actually come of this. I should knock on wood, I guess. And I think that is the main one I wanted to highlight on here, just so you're aware of. On to the next slide. And as you can see, it keeps going. So it is 1243 is also requiring the governing body of each public school to have a policy regarding the participation of habitually truant students in extracurriculars. Um, so this is just asking that you create a policy. It's not saying what that policy needs to be, whether you want to include them or not, but you have to create a policy on this. All right, next slide. I don't want to keep you guys here all day, so I'm trying to just hit some of the high points. 1001. So this hits on, if you remember, the career scholarship accounts that were created last year, and then the education scholarship accounts as well, created in 2021. So the career scholarship account, just a reminder, is focusing on getting students access to that work-based learning opportunities, internships, to apprenticeships, you name it. So it's still a very new program. This was the first year that it launched this school year. So it expanded the funds for this program to be able to use them for transportation costs to get you to that work-based learning opportunity. There are some requirements in there, but the main thing, you cannot use these dollars to buy or lease a vehicle. So just to be clear on that one. And then you can also use the funds to help obtain a driver's license. But once again, there are some requirements in there. And then it's also expanding currently in law, parents had 7 days from when their application was approved by the treasurer of state. They had 7 days to go in online and create that account. So not a lot of time, very easy for parents, for anyone to miss. So they expanded that to 30 days just to make it easier for parents, schools, for everyone involved. Then looking at that ESA program. So this is one, while a student cannot use an ESA to attend a charter full time, charter schools can offer a course that an ESA student can buy. So I just wanted to hit on that. You can offer a couple courses. They just can't be a full-time student at any sort of public school. So this one expanded. If you remember, the ESA program only applies to special needs students. This expands it to include their siblings as well. So now entire families that may have one student in, they can all access the school or the same courses of their choice. But once again, you cannot be fully enrolled at a public school. I think those are the main highlights. So on to the next slide. So Senate Enrolled Act 8, the main piece I want to mention on here is the Indiana College Core. There was a lot of discussion on this piece. When the bill originally came out, it required all schools to just outright implement the Indiana College Core. There was no any sort of exceptions, whether it made sense for your school or not, whether it was a challenge for your school or not. They just asked you to implement it. So we were able to walk them back. So now there's a couple exceptions. So you can either implement the Indiana College Core in this next school year, or you can submit a plan if you plan to implement the College Core in the next 2 years, or the last option is a feasibility report. And that's really just, you're explaining why it may not be feasible for your school to offer this. So there's no requirements that you have to offer it. If you do the feasibility report, there's no requirement. However, that does not mean in future years they may not come back and try to require it more. So I will be keeping an eye on that, see what they plan to do. But right now, there's no requirement. You just have to submit. You have to do one of these options, or at the worst case, you do the feasibility report by October 1 of this year, if this is something that doesn't work for your school. There's a lot of other pieces in here that I more so just wanted everyone to be aware of, not necessarily new requirements or anything on a school, but I wanted you to be aware of them and kind of what's happening in the higher ed space. So on to the next slide. So 211, this is one, I'm not going to walk through every piece of it, but I did want to include it just so you know that it's out there. But it's definitely smaller compared to a lot of these other bills. So on to the next slide. 1104, so this is school safety. It seems like they have a school safety bill every year. So this does require a school safety plan developed by a public school. It has to have an armed intruder drill protocol. There's a lot of other little pieces in here as well. I think that's the main one I really wanted to give you a heads up on. And there's some other requirements that go with it. But that's all I'll focus on at this time. So on to the next slide. 1042. And I promise we're almost at the end. I know it's been a lot of me talking. We're almost there. So 1042 is the transition to teaching scholarship. This was something that was passed last legislative session, and they're expanding on it because it's been so successful. There's been a lot of people taking up this scholarship so that they can become teachers. So this is further kind of expanding it, especially when they look at the dollars. So essentially any balance that's in the Next Generation Hoosier Educator Scholarship Fund that's remaining after they've given out all the scholarships, they can then use that money for this transition to teaching scholarships. So any dollars that are left over will go to transition to teaching. So hopefully more money for this scholarship since it's been incredibly successful. There's a lot of people that want to access it. And I think that is the main thing I want to cover. So on to the next slide. 1233. So this is another one that they made additional changes to that originally passed in the 2023 session, and they just expanded on it further, cleaned it up. It's been successful as well, and so that's one they want to keep growing. And so they tried to encourage it further this year with some kind of additional tweaks. So community-based robotics competition teams are now able to be included as well. They made a small tweak to the eligible expenses so that you can use the dollars on, so current law says that you can use the dollars on attendance at a robotics competition. And this just further tweaked it a little bit more that to really clarify that you can use the dollars on any expenses associated with a robotics competition, so not just attending. So small tweak, but could be very critical for those using it. And those are the main pieces. On to the next slide. Okay, just a couple more. We're almost there. 1137, release for religious instruction. So this was something that was already allowed in law. It is now becoming a requirement, but it's essentially requiring that a principal at a public school can allow a student to attend religious instruction off of the campus, so it cannot be on the campus, off campus, if there's written notice from the student's parents. And there is requiring that, you can't, it cannot be longer than 120 minutes. And the parent and the entity offering that religious instruction has to work with the school. So everyone needs to work in combination to find the best time period so that it's not disrupted to the student's education. So that was something that was already allowed. As I said, they just strengthened it, made it more of a requirement. I'm not, I guess you guys would know better than me. I'm not sure how prevalent this is across the state, but I know there was one specific school that it was kind of focused on up north, a traditional public school. And then 185, this is one that has been in the headlines as well. This is regarding cell phones. Really any kind of electronic device, so tablets, laptops, gaming devices, and it's requiring schools to adopt and implement a policy prohibiting students from using these during instructional time, but there are some exceptions. So if they need that device for their IEP, if a teacher authorizes it for education, or if there's an emergency. And then schools also have to publish this on their website, this policy. On to the next slide. 282. Okay, I think we've only got one more bill after this, so we're almost there. I know this is taking a while. So this is looking at absenteeism. That's been a big topic this legislative session, and I would expect more legislation on it next year to be introduced. So each public school has to establish a truancy prevention policy for students looking at K through 6. There's obviously some other pieces into this, looking at the prosecuting attorney and having them notifying parents of a child in some of these kind of truancy situations or habitual truancy. But that is the main piece I wanted to highlight. That's really something they're going to try to focus on. I heard it a lot this legislative session that the students can't learn, they can't be proficient in reading if they're not even there. So I've heard that over and over again. So that is something that I believe the legislature will continue to say in the coming years as well. On to the next and I think final bill. Yeah. So this is one, it's not a new requirement or anything, but I just wanted to give you a heads up on. It's been in the news quite a bit, just looking at anti-Semitism specifically. So just something to be aware of. And with that, on to the next slide. So this is the link that we will send out to everyone. You can go into this link and see the bills, really walk through them and read them and see more than what I have just highlighted. But if you do have questions, feel free to reach out after you're looking at them. And then I think on to the next slide. And if you have any questions now, feel free to chime in. One thing I did want to highlight though, next year is a budget year. So we will see what ends up happening, but it is always a focus for us to increase or bring parity to funding for our charter school students. And that is something that will be a top priority for us again. So anytime between now and then that you have an opportunity to talk to anyone in the legislature and advocate for this, we would strongly encourage it. Feel free to touch base with us if you need any other support. But we want to keep working to close that gap for all your students. And back to you, Marcy.
Whew, you wouldn't know that was a short session, would you, Molly?
I know, it seems worse than a long session.
It does. Thank you so much for going through all of that. As Molly said, we'll get all this out to you so you can take a little bit of time at your leisure to digest or just to keep this in your back pocket and you can refer back to it. And I'll reemphasize, as Molly said, that over time, starting in the coming weeks, DOE will put out a document that they'll continually update with guidance for various bills. So we'll make sure to send that out once it's available. And we will all just keep moving forward together as we do every year to figure out how all this stuff will work in practice. But please ask any questions if you have any right now. Everyone's exhausted and overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I don't blame you guys. It's a lot, but you can always reach out to us later on if that's easier as well.
Yeah. And please do. All righty. I think that settles it. Everyone is tired on Friday afternoon. And I know you are too, Molly. So have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you all soon.
See you guys.